With question 71 of the Prima Secunda, we have now entered into a new treatise, and it's very, very different than what we've been doing for the last 15 or 16 questions because, as opposed to talking about good habits and virtues, we now are talking about their opposites. It is the treatise on evil habits, vices, and sin. It's going to go from 71 all the way to 89, so we're going to be doing this for a couple of weeks now. And question 71 has 6 articles of vice and sin considered in themselves. And as we continue to journey through the Summa, I want to point out that we have to be looking at the big picture. What exactly was St. Thomas Aquinas trying to accomplish in the Summa? And it reminds me of a conversation I had with an old Dominican priest friend of mine many years ago, Father Robinson. He was in his 90s, and he was a big, devotee of St. Thomas Aquinas. And I asked him to summarize the Summa in as few words as possible, and he said he only needed one word, and he said nature. Okay, so nature is a very important word in the Summa, and in this regard, it's our nature as human beings. What does it mean to be a human being? And I think a lot of that is going to come out in these 6 articles, because are we by nature sinful? Are we by nature virtuous? And by what standard do we determine what our nature is supposed to be? So all of that is going to come out in these 6 articles, I promise you. And so the first of the articles is whether vice is contrary to virtue. And you probably would expect, yeah, I think it is. And you're certainly right if that's the case. But of course, Thomas is going to go a little bit more into detail about this. He says 2 things may be considered in virtue: the essence of the virtue and that to which virtue is ordained. In the essence of virtue, we may consider something directly, or we may consider something consequently. Virtue implies directly a disposition whereby the subject is well disposed according to the mode of its nature. Okay, nature. There we go. There's that word. Wherefore, Aristotle says that virtue is a disposition of a perfect thing to that which is best. And by perfect, I mean that which is disposed according to its nature. That which virtue implies, consequently, is that it is a kind of goodness, because the goodness of a thing consists in its being well disposed according to the mode of its nature. That to which virtue is directed is a good act, as was shown above, okay, in question 56. Accordingly, 3 things are found to be contrary to virtue. One of these is sin, which is opposed to virtue in respect of that to which virtue is ordained, since, properly speaking, sin denotes an inordinate act, even as an act of virtue is an ordinate act and a due act. In respect of that which virtue implies, consequently, that it is a kind of goodness. The contrary of virtue is malice, while in respect of that which belongs to the essence of virtue directly, its contrary is vice, because the vice of a thing seems to consist in it not being well disposed in a way befitting its nature. Hence Augustine says, whatever is lacking for a thing's natural perfection may be called a vice. So there you have the question about nature. Okay, in the next article, he's going to go into a little bit more detail about this. But yes, certainly, vice is contrary to virtue, and both of them are habits, where you have a good act and a bad act, but a good act and a bad act are not in and of themselves habits until they become habitual, until they become something that we almost don't even think about and we do it. All right, so is vice contrary to nature? Are we by nature good? Are we by nature virtuous? Or are we by nature bad? I think you ask 100 people and you're probably going to get different answers for that. He says, as stated above, vice is contrary to virtue. Now, the virtue of a thing consists in its being well disposed in a manner befitting its nature. Hence, the vice of anything consists in its being disposed in a manner not befitting its nature. And for this reason is that a thing vituperated, he's getting into a little etymology here, which word is derived from vice according to Augustine. So vituperation is the word there. But it must be observed that the nature of a thing is chiefly the form from which that thing derives its species. Now this is very important. Now man derives his species from his rational soul, and consequently whatever is contrary to the order of reason is, properly speaking, contrary to the nature of man. as man, while whatever is in accord with reason is in accord with the nature of man as man. Now, man's good is to be in accord with reason, and his evil is to be against reason, as Dionysius states. Therefore, human virtue, which makes a man good and his work good, is in accord with man's nature as much as it accords with his reason, while vice is contrary to man's nature insofar as it is contrary to the order of reason. So there you go. There's a relationship between our nature and our reason, because we are rational creatures, and therefore, as a rational creature, and our soul is our rational soul, in order for us to be in accord with our nature, we must follow reason. Now, in the 6th article, you're going to find what our reason is determined by. Okay, our reason is not the end-all, be-all of things, but it has to conform to something else. But that'll come in article number 6. And by the way, you would have a different standard by judging a dog or a frog or a platypus or a whale. They're not rational creatures, and so their actions are not going to be judged according to any kind of standard of reason, because they don't have reason, right? Whether vice is worse than a vicious act. Interesting. What he's going to say here, I'll just kind of summarize, is that habits are made up of acts, right? And so an action is going to be worse than a vice because it's the cause of vice. Just like a good action repeated and becoming habitual becomes a virtue, right? And so the actions are what causes us to have virtues in the first place, and also a vicious act would also be the cause of vice when it becomes habitual. All right, whether sin is compatible with virtue. And this is an interesting one. I'll read this. Sin is compared to virtue as evil act to good habit. Now, the position of a habit in the soul is not the same as that of a form of a natural thing, for the form of a natural thing produces of necessity an operation befitting itself. Wherefore, a natural form is incompatible with the act of a contrary form. Thus, heat is incompatible with the act of cooling, and lightness with downward movement, except perhaps violence be used by some extrinsic mover. Whereas, the habit that resides in the soul does not of necessity produce its operation, but if is used by man when he wills. Consequently, man, while possessing a habit, may either fail to use the habit or produce a contrary act, and so a man having a virtue may produce an act of sin. Now, I'm just going to summarize the rest of this and not read it directly, is that you may have the virtue of, being in the habit of exercising, but then one day, for whatever reason, you get sick or you're just not feeling it, and you don't, and instead of working out, you go in McDonald's, and and you did something contrary to that virtue. Well, it doesn't mean you've lost the virtue. It just means that particular act was not conducive to the virtue, but then you hopefully you get back into the swing of things, right? So you can have virtue and still sin. Okay, having a virtue doesn't mean you're incapable of sinning, but he does make a distinction with theological virtues, because if you do commit a mortal sin, you cut off virtue, you cut off charity, you cut yourself off from the outpouring of charity and that grace, that virtue, and also faith and hope are going to be affected as well through one act of mortal sin. Now, Article 5, it's kind of long, but I find it really interesting, and I hope you will as well, because St. Thomas Aquinas is going to talk about sins of omission. And he's going to use an example of somebody not going to church, not going to Mass. And he really analyzes this. And I want to read it in its entirety. It won't take that long, because I think it's interesting to get into the mind of St. Thomas Aquinas as he goes through all the different possibilities of whether a sin of omission, like not going to church, is an action, and whether it includes an action or not. And so just hang with me here, and then there's only one article after that. He says, the reason for urging this question has reference to sin of omission, about which there have been various opinions. For some say, in every sin of omission there is some act, either interior or exterior. Interior, as when a man wills not to go to church, when he is bound to go, exterior as when a man, at the very hour that he is bound to go to church, or even before, occupies himself in such a way that he is hindered from going. Okay, you see the difference there? In one case, you just will not to go. Another case, you occupied yourself with something and then you end up not going, right? This seems in a way to amount to the same as the first, for whoever wills one thing that is incompatible with this other wills consequently to go without the other, unless perchance it does not occur to him that what he wishes to do will hinder him from that which he is bound to do. So now there's a third possibility that he didn't think about it, right? In which case he might be deemed guilty of negligence. On the other hand, others say that a sin of omission does not necessarily suppose an act, for the mere fact of not doing what one is bound to do is a sin. All right, so now Thomas says each of these opinions has some truth in it. For if in the sin of omission we look merely at that in which the essence of the sin consists, the sin of omission will be sometimes with an interior act, as when a man wills not to go to church, while sometimes it will be without an act at all, whether interior or exterior, as when a man at the time he is bound to go to church does not think of going or not going to church. Okay, he didn't even think about it. So there's a lot of different possibilities here. Thomas continues, if, however, in the sin of omission we consider also the causes or occasions of the omission, then the sin of omission must be of necessity including some act. For there is no sin of omission unless we omit what we can do or not do, and that we turn aside so as not to do what we can do or not do must needs be due to some cause or occasion, either united with the omission or preceding it. Now if this cause be not in man's power, the omission will not be sinful, as when anyone omits going to church on account of sickness. But if the cause or occasion be subject to the will, the omission is sinful, and such cause, insofar as it is voluntary, must needs always include some act, at least the interior act of the will, which act sometimes bears directly on the omission, as when man wills not to go to church because it is too much trouble, and in this case this act of its very nature belongs to omission, because the volition of any sin whatever pertains of itself to that sin, since voluntariness is essential to sin. Sometimes, however, the act of the will bears directly on something else which hinders man from doing what he ought, whether this something else be united with the omission, as when a man wills to play at the time he ought to go to church, or precede the omission, as when a man wills to sit up late at night, the result being that he does not go to church in the morning. Okay? All these different scenarios. In this case, the act, interior or exterior, is accidental to the omission, since the omission follows outside the intention, and that which is outside the intention is said to be accidental. Wherefore, it is evident that then the sin of omission has indeed an act united with or preceding the omission, but that this act is accidental to the sin of omission. Okay? I love this. I mean, it's great to get into the mind of Aquinas. Now, okay, final little tiny paragraph. Now, in judging about things, we must be guided by that which is proper to them, and not by that which is accidental, and consequently it is truer to say that a sin can be without any act, else the circumstantial acts and occasions would be essential to other actual sins. Okay, so anyways, I found that interesting. This is the final article. This is much shorter. Whether sin is fittingly defined as a word, deed, or desire contrary to the eternal law. Remember I said earlier about when we were talking about reason being the standard by which we are accord with our nature. Now he's going to talk about reason here. It's very short. Sin is nothing else than a bad human act. Now, that an act is a human act is due to its being voluntary, when it be voluntary as being elicited by the will, that is, to will or to choose, or as being commanded by the will, the exterior action of speech or operation. Again, a human act is evil through lacking conformity with its true measure, and conformity of measure in a thing depends on a rule from which, if that thing depart, it is incommensurate. Now, there are two rules of the human will. One is proximate and homogeneous, that is, the human reason. The other is the first rule, the eternal law, which is God's reason, so to speak. Accordingly, Augustine includes two things in the definition of sin. One pertaining to the substance of the human act, that which is the matter, so to speak, of sin when we say a word, a deed, or a desire. The other pertaining to the nature of evil, and which is the form, as it were, of sin when he says contrary to the eternal law. So real quickly, remember we went over the four kinds of law: eternal, divine, natural, human, right? And so eternal law is basically all things that are true. It's divine reason. It's everything in the world that's true. And so when we go against the eternal law purposely, intentionally, in a deed, a desire, an action, then we have sinned, right? And so, and that's why God gives us reason, in that we can reason through these things, and that's what makes us very unique and special as creatures, is that we have divine, eternal law, but also built into us reason, which is associated with our will as well. Okay, I hope that makes sense. I know this one is a little bit longer than usual, but I hope you enjoyed it. I appreciate you hanging with me on this question 71 of Prima Secunda in this treatise on bad habits, vice and sin. God bless you.